What's going on, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. Dreamland again today by Sam Quinones for the book club. I apologize in advance. There's a lot of very difficult names to pronounce in this chapter, so if I slaughter somebody's name, I apologize. There's a lot in this one, and I've already tried to film this chapter 3 times, and I can't make it through because they're so difficult to pronounce. So this chapter is called Like Cigarette Executives. It's on page 278, and this is the last take I'm doing. I don't give a shit. Portland, Oregon. Because every call means money, Jalisco boys never ignore their phones during business hours. Thus, Milwaukee Police Detective Tom Garrett was surprised that after calling the phone of a Jalisco boy known as Doriro for a half hour, no one answered. Garrett and his colleagues were now full bore into investigating the heroin overdose death of Tuvy Sinayev, the son of Russian Pentecostal couple Anatoly and Nina Sinayev. A dozen harried days had passed since Tovy's mother found him comatose in his bedroom. Under pressure, his sister Alina told police that their dealer was a Russian Pentecostal heroin addict named Alexei Dzuba. They put a wire on Alina. She called Dzuba. See what I mean? We're doing good, though. Going through the withdrawals and with her brother on life support, Alina met the dealer in a Safeway parking lot, surveilled by a dozen undercover officers. She bought heroin from him and passed him some marked cash. As he drove from the parking lot, officers descended and arrested him. With that, a strategy that Portland had adopted to combat the Jalisco boys was set in motion, named for a college basketball player who died in 1986 after using cocaine a friend had given him. A so-called Len Bias case is based in federal law. Under that law, a person who supplies drugs that cause a fatal overdose can be charged with a conspiracy that results in death, a charge that carries a 20-year prison sentence. Cops have to prove the person died from the suspect's drugs. A chain of custody has to be established. But if they can do that, they have a powerful prosecutorial tool, and one that was getting a closer look in many parts of the country as the opiate epidemic and fatal drug overdoses spread across the nation. One place that refined the strategy was Portland, Oregon. The benefit prosecutors see in Len Bias is that it allows investigators to work up a chain of drug distribution. To save himself from a Len Bias prosecution, a dealer needs to flip, and quickly, burning the dealer one link above him in the chain, hoping for leniency at sentencing time. The last man detectives can trace the drugs to faces 20 years if convicted, a fateful game of musical chairs. Thus, a heart-to-heart takes place in an interrogation room. Investigators can't threaten a subject, but they can tell him what he faces under federal law. The tone of the room definitely changes, Garrett said. You're not joking with them. It's a very powerful conversation. Speaking through a Russian interpreter, Dzuba bridled at this idea. People every day die for their addictions, he told the interrogators. He wasn't to blame for their choices. Finally, though, a defense attorney explained the situation. Dzuba gave up the name of the junkie dealer he bought from. With that, Garrett and his colleagues began working up the chain. Dzuba's dealer gave them the name of his supplier, who in turn gave them his dealer. This dealer, 3 levels up from Tovy, said he bought daily from a Mexican he knew only as Doriro. This is how, on April 12, 2011, Garrett and his colleagues began calling the number of a man from Nayarit they would later learn went by the name of Joaquin Segura Cordero. They received no answer. They called through the afternoon. Nothing. Unbeknownst to them, Segura Cordero was at that moment being arrested by another department. Portland police had their own Len Bias death case against him. This one originated 3 hours away in Bend, Oregon, where a kid named Jedediah Elliott had overdosed and died a couple of months before. Both heroin chains led to Segura Cordero, who, as it turned out, was a kind of regional sales manager for a Jalisco heroin cell. Normally, as a Jalisco regional manager, Segura Cordero would have been insulated from the kind of day-to-day heroin sales that would expose him to arrest. But Segura Cordero had faced a classic small business problem, a labor shortage. He had several runners arrested, so he'd run out of runners, said Steve Migrant, one of the prosecutors in the case. He was having to expose himself. He was taking calls and making deliveries himself. Migrant is a Clackamas County prosecutor deputized to try federal cases. Segura Cordero was his first Jalisco Boys case. By the time I spoke with him a couple of years after Tovi's death, Migrant sounded both harried and amazed by the Jalisco system. It used to be that you go into the ghettos to buy heroin from street corners, he said. Now these organizations are coming to the neighborhoods, to suburbia. They come to you. That's unique to this organizational model. They're all coming out of Nayarit and all operating off this dispatch style. Like the fishermen in Alaska, they work 7 days a week and go home and play. The Segura Cordero case showed that Jalisco heroin spread for 150 miles around Portland. It went out to the quietest rural counties, where kids addicted to pills learned to drive to Portland, buy cheap black tar, and triple their money back home while feeding their own habit. In classic Jalisco style, every junkie became a salesman. The federal prosecutor who has done more Len Bias cases than any other, who worked out the kinks in the way these prosecutions work, is a woman named Kathleen Bickers. Bickers' first heroin cases in the late 1990s were of Jalisco cells. We were doing the Nayarit guys, but we didn't really realize it, she told me. But in time, she saw the cells' connection to Nayarit and to each other, how they stretched from Portland across the west and out to Columbus and then the Carolinas. Now she called the whole thing cooperation heroin. They are the Philip Morris of heroin, she told me in her office downtown Portland one day. They think like cigarette company executives. The corporate nature of the model. They depend on that cash flow. They're not going to go away because you incarcerate a few individuals. You have to cut the labor force off at the knees. You have to make the people from Nayarit realize, when you come up here, you may never go back, or it may be 15 years before you go back. As she spoke, I thought back to the conversation with that fellow in prison from whom I first heard the name of the town Jalisco so long ago now. He had lived in Portland, working legally as a mechanic as he watched the Jalisco system expand. In Portland, he said, I'd see the police grab people with 20 or 30 balloons and they'd let them go. That's why people began to come to Portland, because they weren't afraid. They saw there were no consequences. We get caught with this and they just let us go. Word spread back to Jalisco that cells did well in Portland, and furthermore, arrested drivers were only deported. More cells crowded into town, he said. This reminded me so much of small-town Mexican business culture. I once visited a village in central Mexico. Tzintzuntzan, Michoacan, Tzintzuntzan, had at least 24 vendors, all selling the same kind of pottery on its main street. There's like 3 Z's, 3 T's. See, this is why and I'm not reshooting, I don't care. It's Tzintzuntzan. Once one person did well selling pottery, everyone started doing it. No one thought to vary the offering. The stores stretched for 5 or 6 blocks, with each selling identical pots and bowls, eager to undercut the others. Mexican small business culture, born of crisis and peso devaluations, was risk-averse and imitative. That described the Jalisco cells. They came and imitated those who'd come before. In so doing, they dropped prices and raised their potency, and the natural result, particularly as OxyContin tenderized the market terrain, was more addiction and more overdoses. None of this was on a kingpin's order. It was something far more powerful than that. It was the free market. Portland's catch and deport policy was an important reason why. The policy was designed for the small-time street addict / dealer who city officials didn't want taking jail space from more serious felons. The Jalisco Boys drivers worked hard to look small-time. In reality, they were the only visible strands of large webs that sold hundreds of kilos of black tar a year across America by the 1/10 of a gram. So for many years, when they were caught, they were deported and faced little jail time and no prison time. As farm boys on the make, they drew a very different message from leniency than what these Portland officials intended. To them, catch and release looked more like an invitation. By the time OxyContin came to Portland in the mid-2000s, the city was famous back in Jalisco Nayarit. The boys crowded into the Rose City. What's more, the arrival of OxyContin meant they no longer had to rely on the old street clients like Alan Levine. There were now many hundreds more to help jumpstart a heroin cell. The addicts were younger and wealthier. Seizures of a few ounces of heroin were big news a decade ago. Now, Bickers said, cops routinely found pounds of the stuff. Len Bias became Portland's new strategy to combat the Jalisco Boys. In Portland, and for presumably the first time in the history of heroin in America, police began responding energetically, 2 or 3 detectives at a time, to a dead junkie in a gas station bathroom. The deceased's cell phone was mined for contacts that could lead them up the Jalisco ladder. Runners were no longer automatically deported. They were told they faced 20 years in federal prison. For Len Bias to work, federal, state, and local government agencies had to cooperate completely. The state medical examiner had to be willing to quickly perform autopsies. The local DA had to give up the case if it appeared the feds had more leverage. Above all, investigators had to share information. This was because, unlike traditional Mexican drug organizations, Jalisco cells actually shared supplies, even with their competitors. Jalisco cases tended to connect like webs. This was forcing investigators to discard turf battles. The ego of a narcotics cop is what makes them great, Bickers said. They're creative, innovative, persistent. They know how to dog a target. But they're very territorial. We constantly have to remind ourselves to break those barriers down, to think organizationally, and not just to think, this is my case. You are going to go up a couple of levels and you're going to run into somebody else's case. You get down to dead people and the cases all look like they're separate, but you work them hard and high enough and you keep your mind open and you'll see the connections. Joaquin Seguro Cordero was one example. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison for selling dope that killed Tovi Sinayev in a suburb of Portland and Jedediah Elliott out in the Oregon countryside 150 miles away. Bickers had another case against 2 brothers from the village of Pantanal near Jalisco, who were the 9th level up of a Len Bias chain. They faced life in prison because of the death of a young woman in Salem from an overdose of black tar that they were accused of importing. As one level led to the next, Bickers watched a web emerge that connected the brothers' alleged Portland cell to suppliers and cells in other parts of Oregon, Las Vegas, and Colorado Springs, and of course, to Nayarit. From Bickers' office, I walked a few blocks to the office of a public defender to speak to an attorney who had agreed to talk to me as long as I left his name out of it. He had convinced many Jalisco boys that their cooperation was the only way to avoid 20 years in prison under Len Bias. The attorney had a standing order to detectives to call him immediately when a Len Bias case began. He supported quick cooperation with investigators, a controversial idea among defense attorneys. The value of your information is at its maximum the closer you are to the time of your arrest, he said. If you're in really quick, you can derive a great benefit from your client, or for your client. Still, he didn't see much effect from prosecutors' new strategy. The pills were so widespread, new kids were getting addicted every day. They were switching to heroin all the time. Against that backdrop, he figured prosecutors were only temporarily disrupting the market. My dental hygienist came to talk to me, he said. Her son was involved with heroin to the point where he was stealing stuff out of stores. This is a middle-class person you'd think would never be touched by something like this. But it's so prevalent. It's almost like you were trying to stop drinking coffee with a Starbucks on every corner. All right, we'll continue on page 283. The next chapter is called No Scarface, No Kingpins. Hope you're enjoying the book, guys. Keep fighting that good fight.